review. And so welcome. In a moment, I'll let you introduce yourselves. But I'm Deputy Tadier, I'm the chair of the panel.
I'm Deputy Max Andrews, panel member.
And if you introduce yourself just for the record, please.
Tony Moretta, CEO of Digital Jersey.
Thank you. I think you've been to scrutiny hearings before, haven't you?
Yes.
So you're aware there's just that form of words in front of you which says effectively you're covered by parliamentary privilege as long as what you say is you believe to be true.
Okay.
So you can speak freely and openly. So if we get started, we've got about an hour for this if we need it. So thanks again for attending on the panel. Firstly, it might be valuable for us to understand a brief outline of the role of Digital Jersey for the record.
So the brief description of what Digital Jersey does is we're an arm's length economic development agency. We get about 85% of our funding from government. That's mostly through the economy department, but partly through the education department. And we're also an industry association, so we get revenues from various companies, small businesses and large corporates in Jersey as well. We have three main focuses, you could say. The major one is economic development, whether that is growing the digital sector of the economy, with the economic benefits that brings, or helping other parts of the economy, whether that's financial services, tourism, agriculture, use technology to improve productivity, performance, etc. We also have a focus on innovation, whether that is development of new products and services for Jersey. A good example would be data trusts at the moment, or running the Impact Jersey program on behalf of government. And we also focus on digital skills through the Digital Jersey Academy.
Good, thank you. So just to give some context for us as well, we've been running a survey which involves discrete responses that people can give digitally, or there's been a paper submission, there's a few of those, but also people have been able to give us written feedback, so some people have availed themselves of that. And thank you for your submission, by the way, which I've read and I've got in front of me, which we will refer to as we go through. You've identified that electronic payments are preferred by the vast majority of consumers, and that the island has seen an acceleration of particularly contactless payments, so it could be card or mobile transactions. And how has this impacted consumers and businesses in your view?
So I think the good example that we all saw was what happened during COVID, where people moved to contactless payments. Those who worked in the payments industry will know that there's always been concerns about hygiene around notes and coins. Some industries obviously have a bigger issue with that than others, hospitality, for example. And then obviously with COVID, it really pushed it. I think my favourite example in Jersey was when we saw the first honesty box that took Revolut, which I thought was a great way of showing innovation, but also how actually anyone can use those digital payments. But another good example, I think I probably put in my submission, is I was heavily involved with government in getting pay by phone introduced. And not only did pay by phone themselves say that they'd never seen a more rapid uptake in a location than they'd seen in Jersey. I think, to be fair, that's possibly because we were relatively late to the game on that. But I'm now told that about 80% of parking is paid for by pay by phone. So it shows you where people have a choice, and let's not forget, and it's quite a good example there, that pay cards were not removed as an option. I think government is reviewing the circulation of pay cards because there is a cost associated with pay cards. You're selling them through merchants, you're giving a commission, there's a cost associated with that. Yeah. But I think that shows that the people of Jersey, and there are stats to show that smartphone usage is higher as a percentage of the population in Jersey than it is, for example, in the UK and many other countries, is left to a choice. The vast majority of people, not 100% though, obviously, which is what you've got to look at, will go for the digital option.
I suppose to take that as an example, what we're seeing there is, if you like, a move towards AMPR, is that what it's called? Automatic number plate.
In a few places in Jersey, but only a couple of places use AMPR. So the airport and the waterfront car park and Sand Street, but most locations.
What we've got is a manual version of that. So now I suppose the traffic warden will have to look at a car. If it's not displaying pay cards, in the past you'd have got a fine, but now you get your number plate scanned.
Yes.
And then they presumably check as to whether you've paid via an app.
Yes. I've not used it myself, but my assumption is, well, I know that the parking wardens will have their own version of the app on their phone, and they just scan the number plate, and that tells them if there's a valid session that has been paid for.
Does that
or
tell
not.
us that we're still in the hybrid stage? Because you still need the intervention of a traffic warden to come along and check the car and then to intervene in what should be otherwise an automatic process?
Well, obviously, to have an automatic process, you look at examples, you don't need traffic wardens somewhere like the airport car park because it's barrier.
Yeah.
And if we put barriers in all of the car parks, you could make that happen as well. But how does that work for on street, for example? So I think one of my first experiences of the media in Jersey was I gave a speech saying I thought pay cards were a bit weird because they are coming here for the first time, because Jersey doesn't have pay and display machines like most places. And I was accused by various people of wanting to get rid of traffic wardens. Well, you still need traffic wardens. You still need enforcement. That's not a technology issue. But you're right. Actually, all technology is hybrid in some form, depending on the implementation. And parking is a great example. We have lots of different ways of parking, whether it's a barrier, who runs it, where it is, how you pay. But certainly, I was very pleased, and the team were very pleased in infrastructure how quickly the take-up was, because actually it's a good example. It is a better experience for consumers. I do remember scratching off 8 one-hour pay cards when I got to Jersey and tweeting there has to be a better way.
Did you win anything?
And no, but I think Sam Mezik's dad posted, yes, there is 2 4-hour pay cards, which is one of my first introductions to Jersey's sense of humour. But you're not having to scratch off the pay cards. You can extend it without going back to the car, which is a big advantage for people. And it is cheaper for government. It is cheaper to run for government. And I heard you talking to Sir Mark about the surcharge. What it shows you how Jersey can do things differently. So typically, if you use pay by phone in the UK with, say, a local council car park, you will pay a surcharge of about 20 pence for doing that. In Jersey, we look very carefully at the economics for government. And government, I think at the time, worked out, it might be different now. There's somebody parked for more than an hour. They were saving money compared to the cost of pay cards. And so there was the justification in Jersey to say, wouldn't it be great if government didn't have to charge any surcharge at all? So that's why I think you're right, you looked it up. There isn't a surcharge from government for pay by phone where there is in most places. So as ever with these things, it's not a blind implementation of the technology. It's reviewing what is the best fit for a particular location.
Good, thank you. If I can maybe cut to what I think is a nub of the philosophical challenge that faces government, if not the wider business community. I think we've had the vast majority of our responses, or certainly a majority, have said that not only do they value choice, which I know you've said as well, but they would actually welcome legislation to oblige all businesses to take cash. That's not what you've said. I mean, I think you've been very specific on what maybe certain types of services and products that could be obliged to take both forms of payment. Could you just talk about that initially?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's one of the things I was going to ask at the beginning. I did read through some of the other submissions that you'd had. There does seem to be a sort of Facebook-type conspiracy that somebody is trying to force the cashless society, which obviously isn't what you're looking to do, quite the opposite in some ways in terms of protecting people. I'm not aware that there is any movement in Jersey. And as I think I said, if we're not pushing for it at Digital Jersey, I'm not sure who would. So there's no push to do it. And again, a good example is I advocated for retaining pay cards when we introduced pay by phone. So I think my position was leave it up to the market, but I do recognise that you can't force people, and we can perhaps go into some of the things Samart talked about what we can do to help people in terms of digital inclusion. But I don't think you should force people to use digital, certainly for certain services. So my view is I'm not an advocate of pushing for a completely cashless society. I think it might happen by itself in time. But I think there are certain services that it should be protected. As was discussed before, it's more expensive to do it, but you can still use cash on a bus. You can still use cash, I assume, if you go and pay your utility bill, if you want to go to government services. I think there are certain services that are regulated, like taxis, for example, work the other way, where government mandated the use of cards, but also to push for, to enable cash as well. So my personal view is if you are going to stage an intervention, it should not be to force businesses to accept cash unless it is in certain categories where you think there isn't a choice. So, if there is a monopoly provider, I think that is different from forcing every coffee shop to take cash. As I think you've discussed before, an individual coffee shop will think, are we going to lose business or not? And is the business we lose going to be made up for in the savings we make by not having cash on the premises? So that's my view. And it was interesting. I only read an article this morning. I don't know if you've seen it. There was a lot of stuff on Facebook and a lot of conspiracy theorists saying, post pictures of Paris quiet during the Olympics, and it said that's because you can only use cash in Paris during the Olympics, and it's complete rubbish. I mean, Paris was quiet in some places because Parisians leave in August and because a lot of tourists avoided expensive hotels during the Olympics. But actually, the opposite was true, because Visa are a major sponsor of the Olympics. You can't use MasterCard or Amex on site. But they enable you to buy prepaid Visa debit cards and branded cards and things like that to use there. But I didn't realize until reading it this morning that in France, there is legislation to protect the use of cash in certain environments. But there are some exceptions to that in terms of security or technology or places where it's just very difficult to accept cash as well. So there are good examples out there.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. I mean, what I think we're potentially all interested in is the fact that there are compelling arguments, I think, for government to and for society to move completely cashless. And we haven't heard a lot about them. I think that some of them are contained within some of the submissions we're working through, and we'll obviously be putting that to government. But I suppose just as an interested citizen, rather than necessarily as the head of Digital Jersey, can you, because you do talk about, in fact, we can ask this as the next question. You talk about that the benefits would be large moving to a cashless society in terms of the efficiencies, but they wouldn't outweigh the loss of choice. Do you think that's an interim problem, and that actually we will end up being a cashless society, and that we probably won't look back when we are cashless?
I think there will come a point, and maybe it's as demographics change, when the vast majority of transactions are cashless, and so there might be other ways of enabling people that can't access the services to I think there was a discussion about giving it to them for free. There are modes of that. If somebody's in a position where they don't access these services, there are other ways of doing it rather than mandating the use of cash. My view is, yes, we talk about productivity a lot as an island. Digital payments are faster. They enable new business models in terms of ordering without having to have the manual process of doing it. Convenience, hygiene, as we talked about, security, very secure. I think it was a good example. I think, again, it was Mark, wasn't it, about theft? It doesn't feel like something we talk about, but if you talk to a lot of small businesses, that's an issue. The security of the time it takes to take it to the bank and things like that. So I think as an island, if we were completely cashless, it would be productive. There are huge costs of cash that I think are hidden from a lot of people in terms of the use of security and things like that. It's just, so much more. I mean, I had a good example today. I think, government of Jersey still seems to be promoting the use of checks. The one check I get a year is from government, and I have to physically go to a bank and actually pay it in instead of, whereas every other organisation will do it online. I don't have to go to a bank. You don't need to take the time to do it. So I think there are huge efficiencies. I think my view has always been, in terms of outweighing it, there would be, as I think you've seen, a lot of resistance if it was mandated. It would make Jersey more productive. It would give us some good PR. It doesn't give us a new industry that we can promote, which is what we're particularly focused on. So there are huge benefits in companies using digital, but I don't think the time is right to force a cashless society on people.
Do you have any thoughts on the black economy, if we can call it that, grey economy?
Yeah, the shadow economy, I think, is
PR.
They call it now. Yes.
Yeah,
So,
black market it used to be.
Well, it is interesting because I don't know whether government have looked at this, but we all know the typical examples. I mean, when people talk about the cost of cash and banking and payments and things, I think there's evidence you've probably already seen that quite often it's cheaper to take sort of contactless payments than cash and then go to the bank. And I mean, even if you just look at the bank fees for taking cash, I think the reality is some businesses don't use that because they don't bank the cash, because they'll use it to pay suppliers and other people like that. And you've got to think, why are some companies and individuals doing that? And it is because they don't necessarily have to declare it. Having said that, government doesn't have access to your bank accounts anyway, so it's more of a perception thing. Because if you say something you declare something in your tax return, government can't check it against your bank accounts. They have that connection. So personally, I think that any reduction in the shadow economy is good for government in terms of tax receipts. I think that is also happening as well. It'll be interesting to look at the stats, but we probably all know that if we buy something or are paying someone, we would rather use Revolut. We'd rather other payment brands are available. We'd rather use our banking app to make a payment, because if we haven't got the cash on us, going into town and going to a cash point, getting the money, bringing it back is quite difficult. So I don't know whether anyone's looked at the size of the shadow economy in Jersey, but I did famously, I think, once get some feedback from taxi drivers who didn't like the fact they were being forced to take credit cards, and they preferred cash for some of those reasons as well. But actually, the biggest driver for that is consumer preference.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. It's not your area, but I mean, there's the shadow economy, but then there's the illegal economy, of course. So, I guess it's not a question for you, but how does the drug dealer who receives cash for his or her heroin that they're selling, how do they buy their coffee if they've only got cash?
That feels like a trick question. I mean, it's really interesting because...
Do you have a program for drug dealers?
Yeah, I used to... In the digital sector, there are obviously some big proponents for cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. And actually, there is an assumption sometimes that cryptocurrencies are anonymous. They aren't necessarily as anonymous as people think. But oddly enough, I used to say the only people who want anonymous payments are the geeks and the crooks. Because it isn't just the crooks that want anonymous payments. There are people who are pseudo-libertarian who think, well, why should government get involved in payments? Most of us don't need anonymous payments. Most of us want private payments. And I think, again, there's quite a lot of misinformation there, because there's a lot of the submissions I saw to your review were saying that actually the reason for keeping cash is that government can't see what I'm buying, what the transactions are, or companies can't. The reality is companies can't, even if you use cards, companies cannot see. Your credit card company knows, for example, that you might have spent X amount of money in Waitrose, but they don't know what you bought. Your bank that issued you the credit card doesn't know. Visa or MasterCard don't know what you've bought because the system doesn't work that way. Waitrose don't know what you've bought unless you have voluntarily you've signed up to a Waitrose loyalty card. I mean, this is where Tesco Club Card came from. So making digital payments doesn't actually give anyone any data on what you've bought.
So one submission we had was from, I don't need to say who it's from, but it was, I think it's a public submission, and his argument was that if a bank is looking to lend you money, you're looking to borrow from a bank, they go through your statements routine, they can see all your transactions. And if, for example, they see that you've been visiting a gambling site on a frequent basis and potentially losing a lot of money, they might say, we're not going to lend you that money because you're bad investment. Whereas if you take out cash and then you lose it at the corner of the bookies, that they may not have that issue. Is that something that you think rings true?
Oh, that's an interesting ethical dilemma, isn't it? Because arguably a bank, if you're applying for it, would ask you to fill in a form and say, what do you spend on something? So if you don't disclose that you spend X amount of money each month on gambling, then you're breaching the terms, you're lying in terms of what you've said. So I think the bank having access to it's again one of those things, isn't it? I think about privacy versus anonymity. Most people don't have anything to hide. Most people, if you look at credit scoring, the more services and transactions, the more data they have. I mean, we've seen it in Jersey, haven't we, where people couldn't get credit cards because they couldn't access our electoral roll and things like that. The more data companies have, the more accurate a picture they can build up. So if things are not done digitally, and this is back to this whole point of there are huge benefits from giving people access to digital payments, digital services, full stop, because quite often you get a better quality of service, better outcomes, better prices quite often. You can if you can buy things online where you can't use cash, I think you've said that before, you get better prices. So actually it should be more about, by all means protect access in certain ways, but what are we doing, I'm sure we'll come to it, to enable people that don't have the same access to have a level playing field.
You're okay to carry on?
Yes, indeed.
Few questions. Thank you, Max.
The panel understands that Digital Jersey have built a relationship with the Estonian representatives who've come over to Jersey, including the ambassador. And I just wanted to really hear your views on Estonia and how they have really managed the adoption of digital transactions, and also ensuring that vulnerable people are also protected who would otherwise be using cash?
So that's a really good question. I don't have the detail for how they protect vulnerable people, but I do know that there is massive take-up of their digital identity scheme. Despite what you might think in Estonia, they don't mandate the digital. There is always an analog fallback on everything. So if you don't want to use digital, you don't have to use it. But one of the stats that I think is quite powerful about Estonia is that 98% of prescriptions are digital. Now that means that the patient, shall we say, has to have either a digital ID card, smart card, or they have to have it on their phone. Because what then happens is that their doctor will issue a prescription. They will go into a pharmacy, any pharmacy, tap their phone or card. The pharmacist will not only be able to actually see what the prescription is, but they will be able to get information and see that this is a legitimate prescription. They can see what they should be charging for that person, what their entitlement is. They also know that medical records will have been updated and checked. Yep. So there's very high adoption there. Estonia's had voting for a long time as well, and they've only been online voting. They've only been able to deliver online voting. I think they've been doing it for about 12 years now, because they have a strong digital ID system. Yep. But what is also interesting is the digital ID system carries over into payments as well. So people can use their card on buses and things like that, either to identify themselves that they already have the eligibility for free travel, or that they can actually pay using that card as well. So by putting that infrastructure in nationally, it gives access to everyone to use that.
Use it, yeah. I know obviously the panel have received hundreds of submissions raising concerns about the use of digital transactions, and of course there is concerns when we see, for instance, the World Economic Forum predicating a move towards a cashless society. So do you believe there is always a need for cash as a backup where technology fails?
Personally, no, I don't. I think it's a preference thing. I don't think it is necessary as a backup. I know there are concerns about what happens when there are outages. I mean, I've been having to remember for a while. I went out somewhere last week for breakfast, and for some reason their card payments were not down. One of the advantages you have with Jersey is they normally know you, and they can take a record of what it is. And I said I'd pop back in and pay. So I don't think there is a need for it, and I think we've seen the benefits of moving towards it. I think it is about I don't necessarily believe in forcing people to take it. I think there's got to be the carrot and stick. You've got to have the nudges. I think you were talking before about is it a surcharge or is it a discount if somebody pays online? The fact is it's a lot cheaper if people pay online. There are still some really silly things in Jersey which cost a lot of money for both sides. So, it might sound, an obvious example people talk about is if somebody is getting their utility bill via email, via PDF, and they're paying by direct debit, that is actually saving money for the utility company, because they're not printing it out, they're not putting it in the post, they're not waiting, they're not manning a cash desk for somebody to come in. So I think a discount rather than a surcharge is the right way of doing it. And there are examples at the moment. You might have seen something, there's a press release that went out a couple of days ago about GPs taking payments online. So right now, if I get a repeat prescription from my GP, they print out a bill for £9 and put it in the post to me for me to pay. Now I will pay then back on a bank card, but there is a cost of doing that. And they worked out it's probably costing them £5 in manpower, postage, delays and things like that, whereas if they could just send a text message or an email and it's paid straight away. Again, that's a productivity saving. They don't need the same level of staff. They don't need the same amount of time taken on things.
As you mentioned just before, we are probably moving towards a cashless society. So when people are speaking about, for instance, money being printed, how would that evolve and change when we're moving towards a digitalised society?
Well, I think it will be reduced. I think, hasn't something come out a few days ago or a few weeks ago by the Treasury in the UK are not making new 1p and 2p coins. There've been discussions about getting rid of copper and rounding everything to the nearest 5p, for example, so you can use silver. I'm sure there's a few people who think that's probably a WEF conspiracy as well, but to get rid of copper. But again, it seems quite archaic having such tiny amounts of money out there. I do know that there are some people in Treasury here who want to keep cash because Jersey's government makes money out of cash and the float value of cash. We still have pound notes here as pound coin and things like that. So again, I think the economics work slightly differently in different places, in different ways.
How does Jersey make money? Do you know?
There is some information online. I remember having words with government quite a few years ago because it looks as if they were promoting cash.
Yeah.
Because somebody had written a blog saying, but this is great, the more cash we have in circulation, the more money. It's effectively the float value, because when you're walking around with £50 in Jersey notes in your pocket, government actually has the money because you've effectively bought those from government. So they've got the money, they're making interest on it. Yeah. It's not making any interest when you've got the money sat in your pocket. Yeah. So there is a float value, so to speak, of the money that is in circulation that hasn't been banked. So as it's floating around, so government does make, I don't know how much it is. It's a reasonable amount of money. It's not earth-shattering, but those figures I think are maintained by Treasury. You might want to ask to see what the current value is of that. Yeah. But I would imagine that has been going down over the years, particularly during.
So that's money
COVID.
that wouldn't exist otherwise, because you wouldn't buy it. You're effectively buying that off the government.
Well, I mean, if we don't have a central bank, which is a whole different issue. If we didn't print our own money, we'd only have money. We'd still have pound notes and coins, but they would be sterling notes and coins. But the money for that float would be going to the UK Treasury, not to the Jersey Treasury. So that is one of the reasons. It's not just tradition that we have our own currency. I mean, obviously we don't print it ourselves. I imagine it's done by printers like De La Rue. But there is a value to the Jersey government of having our own notes and coins in circulation.
Also, Tony, I'd just like to ask, the central bank digital currency was mentioned in a couple of the submissions, and I was wondering whether you could explain what your understanding is of that.
Well, I thought Sir Mark put it quite accurate when he said it's not that anyone is consumers are particularly crying out for it, because I'm not sure any of us need new payment mechanisms. I mean, most of us find that what we have in our pockets, cards, phones, things like that, work just fine. It's the central banks wanting to do it. And it's back to what I said about the value of this float and the income they get. And what is interesting with central bank digital currencies, and I think I might have sent you a copy of this a while back, there's an article on it. Actually, in Europe, they're looking at two separate central bank digital currencies, which doesn't sound confusing at all, does it? One of which would be accounted, so you'd see transactions, but another one of which would enable you to make person-to-person payments. Now, okay, we can make person-to-person payments now with bank accounts and Revolut, but that is tracked. There's an audit trail. There are ways of making payments person-to-person without anyone knowing about it. The UK invented a technology in the 90s I was involved with called Mondex, which was, and we worked closely with the Bank of England on that as well. Because you can imagine there had to be very high security because no one had a record of me paying money. And would you believe that was actually having something like probably the size of a mobile phone, and you put your card in one end, this before contactless, so contact smart, I put my card in the other, and we'd use that device to transfer money from the chip on my card to the chip on your card. And people are developing versions of central bank digital currencies for that as well. Personally, I'm not sure what problem they're trying to solve. I think governments are trying to solve a problem because governments have had control of the money supply, they've had control of notes and coins, the likes of the Bank of England. I think they are looking to see, I think it's a control thing. How do they, and not control of our lives, not the conspiracy stuff about seeing our transactions, just control of the monetary system. Because right now, and it's done through the banks and it's digital, they're not getting, they don't have quite the same control, they don't get the value of the float. And also it gives them more control. If you think about payments and the numbers of people that now use an Apple wallet or a Google wallet. And my bank in a way is a dumb pipe now. I'm using Apple technology. I might be using my card that, well, my card is not sitting in my Apple phone. That's a whole separate discussion about tokenization. But when you talk about security, I don't have any worries about the security of that system. I mean, you know, if I've got a card, this one I had anyway, it's not a prop. That card might look graphically as if it's sitting in my wallet on my Apple phone, but actually it's not. There's a completely different number. That's the tokenization. There's a token representing my card, and that security is going through Apple. It can go through Google if you've got an Android phone. But I think central bank digital currencies are the central banks looking to sort of take some sort of control back of the money supply, and I'm not convinced they're ever really going to take off. They could work between banks, like an interbank transfer and things like that, but I'm not sure there's a problem for consumers that it's trying to solve.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. You've touched on cryptocurrency, but do you have any comments on the development of cryptocurrency, its potential increase, and becoming more mainstream in its use, and Jersey's ability to make use of developments in this area?
So it's interesting when you say about the use of it. The beginning of Bitcoin, if you remember, people were talking about you'd be buying pizzas with Bitcoin now. I think anyone that looks back on a statement and sees that they used Bitcoin to buy a pizza 10 years ago will regret it now, because would have been worth a lot more if they kept it. If you look at how cryptocurrencies are used now, they're not generally used transactionally. They're not used to buy things in shops. There are a few examples of that. And actually, it is a really inefficient way of buying things in shops. If you look at the energy consumption and the cost of mining Bitcoin to do it, and the number of transactions it can handle, it's minute compared to what Visa and MasterCard and Amex can do. So it's not a good way of buying. It's been used as more of an asset class. It's more of an investment. People are using it. So when you talk about digital assets and having crypto, I think that is where it has taken off and grown. It's not being used really as a transactional currency for people to buy things in shops. And so, you know, there are people, we are talking to someone locally who's interested in looking at, you know, something which could be a stable coin. So that's you know what stable coins are. Whether we could have a Jersey pound, a Jersey digital pound. So there are things we could do about that, and there will be some people who will be interested in that. Personally, though, again, you come back to nobody has a problem really making payments, whether they're using debit cards, credit cards, cash, prepaid cards, or whatever.
Thanks.
Yeah. I know some people have mentioned concerns about money laundering or fraud, but I'd like to have your views on transactions, for instance, that we see in cash and also, say, with digital in relation, say, to money laundering and fraud, and do you see there being benefits with the move towards digitalisation of transactions?
Yes. I mean, without going into detail, I think the fact that with digital payments, you have an audit trail. You see those, this is back to what I said about people worry about emulating cash with digital payments. Yep. It's also a very expensive way of doing it because you have to build massive security into it to make sure nobody's fraudulently creating, you know, counterfeit digital currency. But yes, by doing things digitally, there is an audit trail. And by the way, that audit trail protects a lot of consumers. Yeah. You know, they can prove that they have paid for something. You know, quite often if you can't find a receipt for something, you can show a bank statement or something to show that you've actually paid. It's not quite what you're talking about fraud, I know, whereas if you've got cash, you don't have that additional record. So I think the more transactions that are done digitally, that's not to say that they're not still open to fraud, but it's fraud of a different kind because there is an audit trail, there is transaction information that you can access.
And would you say there are any vulnerabilities with the digitalisation of transactions as well?
None that I can think of. I think the vulnerabilities are more in terms of what happens if something goes down. And actually, if you look at the uptime on these things, there might be well-known examples. And actually, one thing I would say, I'm arguing myself in a way, I think Samart was talking about the recent example of the CrowdStrike. Yep. So interesting enough, I think if you're at Gatwick Airport, some of the coffee shops like Starbucks, their tills went down in terms of taking payments. Now, actually, I don't think they allow cash payments anyway, but there were stories of people going to a cash point that was working in Gatwick to get cash because some merchants didn't take it. But these things, if you look at it as a percentage time, is a very, very small downtime. The security, you know, if you look at the fact that we might all have different banks providing it, but the fact that all of our credit and debit cards either have Visa or MasterCard on it, or some of them will Amex. Those schemes have been around for decades. The security levels that are built into them as global schemes, as I started to talk about, the security that goes into payments for, mobile payments, for example, with the, phones have secure elements. They have chips in there that can't be broken into, can't be hacked. If you think about the chips that are on if you look at the development, if you quite often look at the credit card in your pocket, there are a range of different technologies on that. So if it's embossed, that is because you might go somewhere where they still have the old card reader, which takes the imprint of the card. So the embossment is one technology. The actual printed stuff is another technology for someone to read out the numbers over the phone. Your cards will still have a mag stripe on them. That's another technology which very seldom would be used now, but it's a backup if you go to a location with a mag stripe reader. They have a chip, all the cards have a chip on it now for contact, to actually insert it into a card reader, and they also have a contactless interface. So the investment that has gone into that technology is astounding. So you compare that investment and that security and the cryptography that's used in the public key cryptography, and you compare that to notes and coins, there's no comparison in terms of the security levels.
And in terms of when we're looking at, say, the envisagement of a cashless society, obviously many stakeholders have raised concerns about privacy, for instance, being a major concern for them. But when we're looking at, say, credit lenders and, for instance, if we're looking at platforms that are relied upon for transactions, when would we likely see those entities have to maybe exchange information with government or government agencies?
Can you be specific? Give me an example, for example. What do you mean?
So, for instance, if there were, say, transactions that were happening, say, with credit lenders, or maybe, say, through a platform, some people are concerned that the government, at one point in time in the future, may try and have access to those transactions. So currently, for instance, in like what event would the government?
So actually, I think there are very good protections there legally. If you look at GDPR, and you look at the agreements, we all sign. We don't always read the terms and conditions. Everything we sign, which that's a different issue. But when you're signing up to an agreement with your bank for a credit card or a bank account, they will provide certain information that, for example, if you go into arrears, that they might provide that information to a credit reference agency. So that is part of the system which protects the system. It protects people as well. So the credit reference agency won't see what you're buying, back to what I'm saying. They won't see where you're spending money, but they will see if you default on a credit card payment or a mortgage payment. And that's important for the system. And actually, the less bad debts we have in the system, the less impact there is on the economy, and we all pay a price for that, as we've seen. I think the sharing of information with government, again, that's very well established. Banks do not share information with government. That would be massive overreach. There's legislation to protect the privacy of individuals. Generally, what you see in the world of technology, I always think it's interesting. For a lot of people who, because of how easy it is to use smartphones and things like that, most people assume that in a digital world, everything is connected to everything else. Most people will assume all your patient records are connected and everything else. Oddly, the more you understand technology, the more you appreciate that even today, most things are not connected to anything else. It's mostly siloed. Facebook's data is just connected to Facebook. Apple's data is within Apple. Twitter's data is within Twitter. Google's data within Google, etc. And so, you haven't got that connectivity to go and see. You would actually need legislation. I'm sure there is somewhere anywhere that they would need to go. Government would need to go to a court to get a judge to say we have the rights to go to someone's bank and access their records. So I think there are a lot of existing protections there, and in many ways, the digital side just gives you more control. It is interesting when you look at data. You talk about Estonia. One of the things I've always liked about the Estonian system is if someone accesses your data from government, they have to use their digital ID as a civil servant, whoever, to access it. You as an individual can get to see the details of anyone who has looked at your data. It's a bit like a government version of LinkedIn. If you go on LinkedIn, you can see who's viewed your profile. You can see who's accessed your data. And they have a process that if you think somebody has accessed your data that had no right to access your data, you can lodge a formal complaint and investigation. Yeah. And a classic example they talked about in Estonia was a politician was admitted to hospital, a senior politician was admitted to hospital. 2 nurses that had no connection with his care actually used their access on the system to view his medical records. And that was spotted. And they were disciplined or fired because of it. Yeah. So actually that's back to the audit trail, the audit trail of data. So actually that gives people a lot of control if you can see who has accessed your data.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
One question, apart from people who don't have bank accounts, can you think of any compelling reason for continuing the use of cash?
It depends what you define as compelling. I think consumer choice, I think, is compelling. If someone wants to use cash, they will use cash. You know, my parents will still carry cash. They now know not to give me cash if they're money in to do a bank transfer. So, well, what would I do with it? And as a man, I don't think I've been to a cash machine. I think I've been to a cash machine once since before COVID. Yeah. And many of us can live in cashless societies if we want to. So I don't think there's a compelling reason for protecting cash apart from consumer choice, apart from concern amongst certain groups.
But let's say if I were the Chief Minister and in a few years' time I was to say I want to make Jersey a cashless society, I've got a plan to transition people who haven't got bank accounts to make sure there's digital inclusion. Would you try and talk me out of that? Or would you offer me, I suppose, in your professional role?
I think my view, personally, so I have been, I won't say who they are, I have been approached by various people over the years from industry and within government to say, shouldn't we be pushing for a cashless society? My view has always been there are bigger priorities. There are bigger prizes to be had from using technology. And also it's quite a big battle. I think you've seen already if someone did that. I used to joke, I'm sure she wouldn't have minded me saying it, I used to joke, I don't want to go into battle with Sarah Ferguson about protecting the rights of older people. And it's not just older people. It's a bit of a lazy stereotype. Lots of older people use the technology all the time. Yeah. Again, I come back to what would that give us? Jersey is so analog in so many different places, particularly in the public sector, sadly. There are many things I would rather focus on. And actually what you would focus on, so, you know, if we had digital ID, and there are lots of people who think digital ID is a conspiracy, but we have registration cards, we have driving licenses, we have entitlement, the entitlements we have with work and housing licenses are a bigger issue in Jersey than lots of places. So I would build up the infrastructure we have to the point where actually you make it really easy for people. So it's the carrot and the stick. I would focus on the carrot rather than the stick.
I mean, we will at some point be talking to, hopefully, to the customs officers, and I know when we went to one of the, I think it was the money laundering recently with the review of Moneyval, they were talking about, you know, they got sniffer dogs at the ports to detect cash coming into Jersey, cash which is being used is a red flag because it probably means it's being used for drugs, for buying drugs. So they're interesting, they don't necessarily sniff for drugs, they sniff for cash.
Right, okay.
And
there's quite often drugs on the cash.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what the quick wins would be immediately if we were a cashless society. Presumably it'd be very difficult for criminals who rely on cash to make a living and to use Jersey for nefarious purposes.
Yeah, I think there would be benefits like that. But again, it depends on how you can enforce that cashless society. You know, if somebody could go to the UK, get hold of cash, unless you want to search everyone at the border. You know, French tourists, for example, coming in and they've got hold of currency and things like that. This is an example to me of whenever I've been asked by this of people and say, surely, Tony, you would want to support this. And I spent, like I said to you before, I spent 5 years of my career in the 90s developing electronic cash. Don't get me wrong, I would absolutely love it if Jersey was cashless. There are huge benefits. But frankly, it would just be such a nightmare to push that through when there's lots of other things we can do around digital health and digital ID and government systems online and sharing of data and things like that. But again, if you get to a point where we have the infrastructure that people have access to those services and know how to use it, it's giving them the skills to use these things and the confidence to use it so that they move over by themselves. That's that's much more attractive to me than banning cash and forcing everyone to use digital.
Yeah. Okay. Incidentally, it wouldn't necessarily be a ban on cash. It might just be like nowhere accepts cash, or no.
Yeah, but again, you can't. Nowhere legitimate accepts cash.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's very difficult to stamp this stuff out even if you really wanted to.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay. So we can look at that a bit more. So what do you think about in terms of the transition? Those islanders who either will not or who need help adopting digital. What's your role in that? Do you think? What could your role be?
So a good example you talked about earlier on, and that was about our work with MasterCard and Community Savings here. What actually happened with Community Savings is they're already providing, and this is an interesting thing to go into, they're already providing prepaid debit cards to, I think, about 300 unbanked families here. And what happened is that the provider of those prepaid debit cards gave 3 months' notice to Community Savings that they were withdrawing support for Jersey as a jurisdiction. That's when you go back to, I think payments are quite a big strategic issue in Jersey. Certain things don't work here. We have our own payments gateway in a company called CityPay here, which we don't support. Personally, I find it disgraceful that government doesn't use a local company to do its payments, even when that local company does a lot of big UK councils, including Westminster, ironically. And government give all its payments business to a UK payment gateway. If we supported a local payment gateway, that would enable it to offer a wider range of services and step in where things like Stripe don't work. But coming back to Community Savings, we work with MasterCard to identify an alternative of somebody who could come in and support Jersey, support Community Savings, and get those cards back out there. And I think supporting the unbanked is really important. Banking is quite unusual. As somebody who spent the first 7.5 years of their career working for a bank, I've been quite surprised at how hard it is to get a bank account. And it's not just an individual thing, it's businesses. New digital companies find it difficult, any new business do it. It's not the fault of the banks, because we are in an international finance centre, because we have to arguably have heavier regulation than lots of places. There are downsides to that, and one of the downsides is the checks and balances that have to go through the banking system means that it is much harder to find a bank account. But there are other technologies, such as prepaid debit cards. One of the reasons we signed an MOU with MasterCard, and that came out of, we introduced MasterCard to government when I think you were talking about the Spend Local card was coming in. We introduced MasterCard to government to help with that whole process. MasterCard thought it was really interesting what happened in Jersey. But having that strategic relationship with MasterCard to help us with payments, because if payments got more difficult, we're already seeing the fact that it's harder to get a credit card here, it's harder to get a bank account, it's harder to get payment services working in Jersey. That's quite fundamental to the economy, and that has to be taken really seriously. So the more I'm sure many people don't realise, we can't take for granted the digital payments infrastructure we have. We have to build relationships. MasterCard is a good one, and make sure that people have access to new services. So our role in many places has been to build those relationships off island, to build we've got some knowledge within the team, but we have contacts with other people. We used to have a fintech ambassador called Dave Birch. I think I sent you one of his articles. He talks about central bank digital currency. It's getting advice. It's been great to see government has actually gone out to tender to get somebody to look at an open finance strategy. We don't have open banking in Jersey, whereas we have it in the UK and across Europe. There's lots of things that I think, as an island, we have to make more of an effort to understand how it works and what the implications are. I don't know whether it came up this morning. The UK now has a dedicated payment system regulator. That was a brand new thing that was created probably about 8 years ago, because they recognised how important payments were. And yet our payments, we passport in from the UK. The JFSC doesn't particularly look at payments. That's not a criticism. They've just not had to. But I think even separate to the review of cash, Jersey needs a payment strategy separately. to make sure that people in Jersey are always going to have access. And finally on that, I would also say there is the skills. The inclusion is giving people not only access, but teaching them how to use this stuff. There's basic citizen digital skills about how you can use pay by phone, how you can use do your tax return online, how you can make payments. I think that's really important, and I don't think we do enough on digital inclusion.
So do you think that, you may have answered this obliquely, but do you think that government needs a plan to manage the decline in the use of cash? Or do you think it can just take a laissez-faire attitude?
I think unless you think, as I said in my submission, that you have to protect access to cash for certain services, I would say it doesn't need a plan. Probably someone in Treasury already has an assumption that the value of the float and the currency have is going down anyway, so you can't assume that money is there. But I think it will happen by itself anyway. And I think it would be interesting. There was talk about a survey later on of saying, if you looked at most businesses and said, what as a percentage of their business, how much is cash now? That will have been shrinking down and down and down. And our figures won't be much different from the UK. And there was, I think, interesting enough, there was an acceleration during COVID. Cash usage popped up a bit as people got back to normal, but it's on that downward trajectory. So I don't think government needs a strategy for that. I think it needs a strategy for making sure that as the world of payments develop, that it still works. So what if suddenly something came in? At the moment, there are some issues with the European Union and Apple at the moment, and that is involving mobile payments. And something could happen which stops Apple. Apple have already threatened to withdraw support across Europe for certain functions. We don't have enough control. We don't have any control really as a small jurisdiction to what's going to happen globally, but we need to understand what is happening. A bit like GDPR, we decided we were going to have adequacy with the EU, but also with the UK post-Brexit as well. That's why I'm saying payments are I do think the government financial services team in the economy department are looking at this increasingly. They're the ones that are looking at when we couldn't get access to credit cards. But what I would say is that payments, full stop, are a big strategic issue for anywhere, for citizens, for businesses, for the future of commerce. And in many ways, I think the cash is a tiny element of it. As I said, it's more of a consumer protection type issue. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. Good. No, thank you. Max, have you got any more questions at the moment?
Yeah, I've just got one question about the local spend card that was utilised during COVID-19. Did you have any information in terms of what people were transacting, or was it kept privately?
We didn't see any information. I've always assumed that there was more information available that perhaps people didn't want released, because I know there was a lot of understandable push to people to spend it in certain ways. I said we got involved fairly late in the day, so we were able to make the introduction to MasterCard. It was quite obviously a big project, it had to be rushed. It's a shame in a way. I think if we delayed it a few weeks, we could have had a branded card for Jersey rather than the thing we had. We could have fixed some of the problems of enabling people to spend it online, because remember, ironically, you couldn't spend it online. I suspect the figures would have shown that lots of people did just go and use it in the supermarket and spend. I think there would have been a fair amount of information. So I know that the information they would have had is what sectors it was spent in. So how much was spent in petrol stations and supermarkets and restaurants and things like that. If they didn't release that information, I can only assume because it would send a message that, didn't fit with whatever the strategy was at the time. But that's another thing. Once you put that money out there, you can ask people to spend it in a certain way, but you can't guarantee.
No.
Because it's a prepaid debit card. They can spend it anywhere that accepts it. And I think the only restriction was not allowing people to spend it online, but that was more of a technical issue that there wasn't quite time to resolve.
Is the technology available to place constraints on consumption in certain places in Jersey if you really want to?
Yes, definitely. In fact, the technology is there. Interesting enough, because, and again, I don't make criticism of this, but because it had to be fairly rushed to go into it, those cards could not be reloaded by individuals. They could only be reloaded by government. Now, that was partly a regulation issue as well, and licensing in Jersey. But yes, you can. I think you'll have seen it years ago when people tried to do it with, I think UK, when it was paying allowances to immigrants and things like that. They could say you can spend it on food, you can't spend it. So this is back to what I said before about what information you can control. You can say which merchant categories it was spent in or used, but you can't stop people from buying individual. So you might say you can't use it in off licenses, you can use it in supermarkets, but whether you can't necessarily stop people buying alcohol in a supermarket, or you can make sure it isn't used in bars and restaurants, it's only used in shops, things like that. So there are ways you can do it if you wanted to. Quite often the reason it's been stopped when people have tried to do it is, again, breach of human rights, forcing people to do things in a certain way.
Okay, can I ask, have you been approached as the Chief Executive of Digital Jersey since the local spend card was used to maybe deliver any project, maybe say to be supporting agriculture or any other specific areas within the island economy?
Oh, well, lots of them. We're doing initiatives between in the economy department and farmers about the data farmers provide. So there are lots and lots of individual projects. I mean, interesting enough, on the spend local card, we made the introduction of MasterCard. MasterCard went back to government, to CLS, and said, we work with governments around the world what to do. And CLS said, actually, we think this is a better fit with Digital Jersey. But we've been working with CLS and looking at opportunities for how, with things like community savings, is backed, I think, by Social Security, isn't it, by CLS as well. So we quite often get approached by government as an external source of knowledge on how these things can work. And quite often we'll put them in touch with someone locally or off island who's got that expertise if we don't have it ourselves.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you.
Can I ask? But we're coming up to 2:30, so that's the time we're supposed to finish. If we go on 5 minutes more, would that be fine?
It's fine with
I'm
me.
not saying we will, but can I just ask about some of the if I can call them carve-outs? So you've said that generally government shouldn't mandate the acceptance of cash, but there may be essential services or regulated services or monopolies. Could you give us some examples? So, for example, if I give you some, and you can, would that include taxis, buses, the ferry company, electricity company?
Yeah, so I think things that government regulate. So you regulate taxis, regulate transport. So a good example with taxis is that government, I think probably about 6 years ago, forced all the taxi drivers to accept credit and debit cards and contactless cards. So, government does that all the time.
Yeah.
So I think making sure that somebody can get in a taxi and use cash, it makes sense, and government regulate that already. So it's not as if you're going into something that's completely private sector that government doesn't have a role in. To be honest, the examples I used were fairly off the top of my head. But again, if I want to go and buy a coffee, if I go into somewhere that won't take cash and I want to use cash, I know I can go down the road to another coffee shop that does it. If I want to pay and hopefully they won't criticise me for using an example, my electricity bill or my phone bill, phone different, but let's say electricity bill or water bill, I'm assuming I can go down to the offices of Jersey Electricity or Jersey Water and pay cash to a cashier. Yeah. And if they said, well, we're only accepting direct debit, that would be different.
But that's even though you've told us it's probably a lot more onerous for a big company like that to operate cash than a coffee shop, which might, cater for a lot of...
I mean, we've had examples before. I don't know whether, you wouldn't have been in the assembly, but you would have been. It was JT, I think, were planning 6 years ago to eliminate paper billing. Now, that would have saved them a lot of money. It's expensive. It's expensive from a systems perspective that you have to be able to do it. There's security, there's the cost of delivering them, things like that. And if I'm honest, I thought that was I thought that was wrong, certainly at the time, probably still would now, that somebody, I don't know, it wasn't you, was it, that brought it to the Assembly? I need to check, because but somebody brought it to the Assembly.
Probably Senator Ferguson, but I would have been there or thereabouts supporting.
Yeah, but somebody brought it to the Assembly, and JT, obviously because JT is 100% government owned, it was a slightly different issue. It would have been interesting to know if it had been, would government have done the same thing if it was Shaw or Airtel? Probably not. but the Assembly actually instructed JT to not get rid of paper.
Yeah.
Now, what is a real shame about that, and I don't know whether it was known, to be fair, is JT were working with us on a plan to reinvest the cost saving they would have made to put basic digital skills training into all the parishes, put PCs into the parishes so people could be shown how to. So the idea was...
Parish staff, you mean?
Well, I don't know where the money, some of it would have gone to equipment and things like that. But the idea is, if you were suddenly told that we're going to get rid of the bill for that, and said, you could go into a parish and they'd help you set up an email account, and you could be sent it as an email, or they said, well, actually, we can send an email to one of your relatives with the bill if you want, and you can get hold of a copy, they can print it out. But government intervened and stopped JT from doing it. Now, again, there would have been a view that that is government owned, government has more of a say in it, and the Assembly brought that proposition. So I think anything that government owns, anything there is a monopoly, anything you think is an essential service, I can understand you protecting that.
And by extension, I know you've talked about the additional running costs for using cash, but is it reasonable for a transport company to say you're going to charge someone more if they don't have a bank account and they can only use cash?
So interesting enough, I mean, I had an argument at the time. I think when I was working with Liberty Bus for them to introduce contactless credit debit cards, because obviously initially when I got here, certainly there was the Avanci card, but you couldn't get on and pay with a mobile phone. You couldn't get on with credit or debit. I don't know whether it's still the case, but when they introduced it, there were 3 different sets of pricing. There was pricing. There's still 3. One for consumer, because now they will say there are different costs and things like that. And again, I think it's very easy from the outside to understand a payment model. And I think one of the problems for Liberty Bus is, they will allow cash to do. You're still allowed to pay cash on the bus.
You are, but it's a premium you pay.
There is a premium to pay. Personally, I'm not in favour of lots and lots of different confusing pricing, but I can understand that. Again, to be fair to Liberty Bus, you don't need a bank account to have an Avanci card. You need a bank account to have a credit or a debit card. You don't need a bank account to have a. So they will say that actually we want to encourage people to get an Avanci card, and they can come to the bus station, they can come to the desk, and they can top it up. So credit to Liberty Bus, I think they are offering people an alternative that can be accessed universally.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you do need a minimum of £10 to top up, but hopefully people will have £10. Thank you, but I know you're not a representative for Liberty Bus.
No. But again, I didn't like the differential pricing between credit and debit and the Avanci card. I thought that was confusing.
Yeah. I'm thinking a bit of London as well. I think you can still pay cash, but you pay for your ticket in advance, so you don't actually go up to a driver. It's all done in advance, so you can pay however you want, whether it's preload, an Oyster card. You can tap with contactless.
Yes, so I think on London buses, you can't pay on the bus in cash. You have to go to a ticket desk or something and hand over cash. Yeah. And charge up. But again, they've got I can't remember this. Have they still got Oyster?
Yeah, still got Oyster.
Yeah.
But a lot of people,
but again,
there's no difference now to paying on contact.
Well, that's the other thing. I think the thing about differential pricing is, why would you force people to keep the Avanci card in their pocket rather than move to a credit and debit, which would just work? So it's where it starts to get complicated.
Yeah, indeed. I think that's all I've got to ask. Max, have you got anything? No. Have you got anything you want to ask us, or any general comments before we finish?
No, not really. I'm just looking at the points I added to myself to talk about. I think we talked about most of it. I do recognise there is a challenge around digital inclusion, and I must admit I only saw that it was a bigger issue than I thought when COVID hit. And as a separate issue, Digital Jersey ran a scheme with the mobile operators to provide free broadband to people that didn't have it at home, school kids who could access it so they could carry on doing their studies at home. I think there is a bigger digital inclusion issue than many of us realise in terms of access to certain services. I don't know the detail. I imagine community savings would, in terms of the unbanked. I think there is further we could go as a community, and whether it's initiative like supporting community savings, which I know already supported, but there's no reason why anyone, if they want to, shouldn't be able to access some sort of prepaid card solution that they can use. But it is about teaching. It's not about forcing them how to use it. It's showing them the benefits of doing it. As I said before, if you have an email address, if you can pay for things online, if you've got a bank account, you will get direct debit rates. You'll get discounts on things. You can shop online and get cheaper prices. Why wouldn't you want to help people do that? And so I think probably digital inclusion is something we don't look at enough in Jersey. I mean, it's not within DJ's remit, but when we've been forced to look at it with things like COVID, I realised it was a bigger issue than I thought it was.
Thank you. Thank you,
Okay, welcome.
Tony, for coming to speak to us. We're good to close. Thanks. Good, are we offline?